Thanks, Rob. Can you hear me okay? Good, good,
Okay.
good. Welcome everybody. It's great to be back and looking forward to a new year of archaeology and Roman history. So I thought we might start it with a bit of a bang because we have our own very own amphitheatre here at Trimontium, and I'm going to talk a bit about that in a moment. But first of all, just to welcome people who have not joined in any of the Trust's activities. And if you're in Melrose, please do drop in to see us at the museum. You'll get a very warm welcome. Um, Tonight's talk for me has been a bit of an odyssey. I've had a lot of background reading to do, and a lot of really interesting facts have come out of that reading. But these are the four books that I've used, and I absolutely unashamedly recommend them. There's Roger Dungal's book, all about gladiators themselves, Roland Auge's book, which looks more at the sort of social and psychological elements of the Roman games. Then there's Tony Wilmot's book about the Roman amphitheatres in Britain, which is absolutely fantastic if you're interested in this building type and the history of Roman amphitheatres in the British Isles. It's absolutely superb. And then finally, I can't recommend enough Keith Hopkins and Mary Beard's book, The Colosseum, because there are some fantastic factoids there, not just about the Colosseum, but about amphitheatres and the whole issue of Roman spectacles and so on throughout the Roman world. So I can recommend that as well. Now, this for us all started back in the 1990s when one of our previous trustees, our dear departed Bill Loney, who is in the extreme upper left of this group photograph, suggested while he was surveying the road structure around about the fort at Trimontium that a dip, a hollow in the ground next to the northeast corner of the fort, was in fact an amphitheatre. Now, that hollow had been noted before, and Sir Ian Richmond, for example, thought it was a gravel or a clay extraction pit that had been used for building the fort. But Bill wasn't sure about that, and he felt that the ground surface, the lower surface of the hollow, was actually lower than the surrounding bank, and that the bank was artificial. And he felt it was likely to be an amphitheatre. So it was, as I say, first mooted in 1991. This is a brilliant LiDAR image taken of the area by Professor Campbell, who's one of our trustees, and Stuart's probably online this evening. And you can see the hollow and the deviation in the road. That used to be the old main road into Melrose. And you can see it takes this flick round the edge of this hollow, very discreet hollow. And when you see that from the air, particularly in frost, you can see that it has, in essence, a bank round about the oval hollow. And it looks quite suspicious indeed for being a very artificial feature. Now, it may well have been a clay or a gravel extraction pit, except that there was no clay or gravel there. And you can see this beautiful kink in the road. Nobody had really commented on it before. This kink in the road as it wanders past the corner of the structure. So how can we say with any confidence that it actually is an amphitheatre? Well, we're very grateful to Bradford University in the 1990s, who decided to excavate and try and confirm the feature. And between 1993 and 1996, there were a number of interventions in the area. There was a very detailed survey that showed that indeed the centre of the hollow had been artificially scooped out. And then some excavation took place latterly, and two or three trenches were put in. And these showed that the bank round about the outside was made of earth and cobbles and material that had been dug out of the centre and thrown up in this sort of double horseshoe shape, with an entrance towards the north and another entrance towards the south, that had been obliterated by the road that I showed you in the aerial photograph. There were a couple of post holes, and it looked as though the bank had been held back. The embankment had been held back by a timber revetment, and then with probable timber superstructure that had long since disappeared. And in terms of finds from the area, the only finds of real note were Caligai hobnails. That's Roman military shoe hobnails. And these were found in the scooped out area of the amphitheatre, which is actually quite gratifying, because these, apart from when they're found embedded within the leather shoes that have been found at Newstead, these hobnails are relatively rare in the soil at Newstead because they're made of iron and they're very easily dissolved by the acidic soil. So the fact that hobnails were found in the bowl of the amphitheatre means that there was probably quite a few there. And what's been noted in the past is that when soldiers' shoes, or these particular types of shoes, are flexing, occasionally they pop out one or two hobnails. So there had clearly been activity in the bowl of the amphitheatre that had been relatively vigorous to make these hobnails pop out. So that effectively nailed the diagnosis that this was indeed an amphitheatre. The other thing that helped, of course, was the discovery in Bavaria of the Kunzing amphitheatre, and it's exactly the same dimensions as Newstead, 37 metres by 30 metres. And Kunzing, again, is an embanked amphitheatre with wooden piles in the oval holding the superstructure in place. So Kunzing, definitely an auxiliary fort amphitheatre. It had been thought before that auxiliary forts didn't have amphitheatres. There's this sort of snobbery in the Roman military buffs that, only the legionaries can have certain toys to play with, and only the legionaries can have certain luxuries. It's becoming more and more obvious now that the auxiliaries were pretty well catered for as well. And because Newstead's a primarily auxiliary fort and Kunzing is an auxiliary fort, it looked as though we had a match here in terms of amphitheatre comparability. And what sort of things might have gone on in that amphitheatre? Well, if you go to the Welsh site, this is North Wales, it's a place called Tominey Moor, and it is a really neat Roman fort that has had a subsequent Motte and Bailey castle built in the middle of it. But off to one side, about 120 metres away from the outer corner of the fort, is this, probably the smallest amphitheatre in Britain. And this is the artist's interpretation from that site of what the amphitheatre was used for. Now, it's highly unlikely that that's its main purpose, that it was for training, because these forts often had parade grounds, training grounds, and it's been fairly strongly suggested that it was not a primarily military, although these are associated with military sites, it wasn't primarily for a military function. Now, it's been suggested for a long time that there would have been professional gladiators fighting in Roman amphitheatres in Britain. And there have been several skeletons found at various sites that have been nominally and tentatively identified as gladiators. And of course, there's the famous group of skeletons. I think there were over 100 skeletons found at Driffield Terrace in York, and they were pronounced as gladiators. They had a lot of the men, they were principally male skeletons, which made it a very unusual cemetery, and a significant proportion, I think about 30%, had been decapitated, either ritually or punitively. It's very difficult to decide whether it's a post-mortem decapitation or it's the actual lethal event. But one of the skeletons there appears to have animal bite marks in his iliac crest. That's the pelvic girdle bone. And you can see these two blow-ups of that crest and the punctures in it. And some work has been done on that to suggest that these indeed are lion fang marks, the canines of a lion. And on the left, you'll see a marble relief of a gladiator being bitten by a lion here and has been felled with the gladiator's hip bone well and truly in the lion's mouth. So it looks as though this is certainly a potential candidate for a gladiator who may have died in York. Now, up till now, no amphitheatre has actually been discovered in York, but it's very likely that York was a legionary base. The 6th Legion were based there laterally, and it's highly unlikely that it didn't have an amphitheatre. It's just not been identified yet. So we have a likely contender then at Newstead for the most northerly amphitheatre in the Empire. There is a wooden structure, Inveresque, which has got a curved side to it with multiple posts and sleeper trenches. And it's been tentatively identified as an amphitheatre as well, although it would be pretty strange in design. It's got a couple of very unusual features. So up till now, as far as we know, Newstead, Trimontium, is the most northerly amphitheatre in the Empire. You can see it here, stuck 100 metres out from the northeast corner of the fort. Now, that distance is pretty standard for amphitheatres, certainly attached to military sites. They tend to lie close to the upper outer quadrants of forts. And here's the amphitheatre at the legionary fortress at Caerleon in South Wales. You can see it here in the bottom left. Quite a substantial one that's got a stone wall. And Caerleon, as you know, was the legionary fortress of the 2nd Augustan Legion. And then here's the amphitheatre in the Wirral. This is at Chester. And again, the amphitheatre just outside the corner of the legionary fortress, this time the 20th Legion's fortress. But amphitheatres didn't have to be outside the walls of structures, either towns or fortresses. Unlike cemeteries, which did by law have to lie outside the confines of the public area, amphitheatres were often inside. And on the left, you've got the amphitheatre of Pompeii, which lies in the southeast corner of the town. And here we've got the amphitheatre at Xanten, which is in Germany, and it's a beautiful site. If you get the chance to go to Xanten, they've reconstructed that particular amphitheatre, and it's almost complete there. So it's well worth a visit. These are sizable military amphitheatres have got a military origin. And some military sites, particularly if they've got a big civilian component, have got 2 amphitheatres. And this is the site at Carnuntum, which is on the Danube. It's not that far outside Vienna. You can take a train out, beautiful museum, some wonderful displays there, and a beautifully excavated site, great visitor centre. And it's got 2 amphitheatres. One that belongs to what's called the Legion's Lager. That's the military camp. And then there's the civilian camp, the Zivilstadt. So you've got a civilian amphitheatre and a military amphitheatre. And this is the civilian amphitheatre at Carnuntum. I took this picture in the summertime when I was there with Holger to go and have a look at some of the displays in Carnuntum. And again, if you're in Austria, if you're in Vienna, please do take time to take the train out to Carnuntum and visit this amazing site. But there are also civilian amphitheatres in Britain, This is Dorchester. That lies just in the corner of the modern town. It's an earth embanked amphitheatre. Probably started off as a henge, but then was adapted and turned into an amphitheatre. Very classic shape. Would have had wooden staging around the edges of it. So the amphitheatres don't have to be attached to military sites. They can be related to civilian sites as well. And we'll talk a bit more about the origins of amphitheatres in a second or two. So what happens in amphitheatres if it's not military parades, because you've got a separate military parade ground for that? What happens in amphitheatres? Were they uniformly spread across the empire, or are there certain clumps and concentrations of amphitheatres in certain parts of the empire? And why? Why is that? Were they only about public bloodletting? Was it just for the gory prurience of that element of human nature that, in the 18th century used to have, 3,000-4,000 people turn out in Edinburgh to watch a hanging? Was it that sort of morbid fascination, or did it have a purpose beyond that? And then why did they stop being useful to the Romans and the Roman Empire? Because they do indeed go out of favour and stop being built and then stop being maintained. So these are questions I'm going to ask as we go through. If we start with what happened in amphitheatres, the one that's in our minds, I suppose, most foremost is gladiatorial combat. And the recent releases of Gladiator 1 and the not so good, I think, Gladiator 2 have heightened public awareness of what the whole gladiatorial thing was about. And the original Latin name for these games, these gladiatorial combat events, were called munera, and I'll explain that in a second. But the venues were also used for animal hunts, and they were called venationes. And then, thirdly and crucially, they were used for public execution and the public humiliation of criminals of all sorts and of all levels of society. And then I think finally only for military displays and ceremonies. And I suspect ceremonies rather than military displays. So that's really our best take on what these amphitheatres were used for. Now, munera, the Latin word munera, means a duty or a gift. And they had their origins in the Republican era funeral celebrations of great men. So when some very prominent figure died, the relatives would get together for a feast after the cremation of the individual, and they would have an entertainment laid on for mourners. Now, originally, the entertainment was, it was a bit like boxing or getting your best fighters to do a one-to-one for entertainment, but it then became more serious than that. And eventually, it led to combat to the death. And in some cases, it would be execution of notable figures would take place at that time. So it was almost an expiation of for the death of the departed. So it very much started as something that took part at the Roman equivalent of a wake. And the name munera goes through, the gift or duty goes through into words like remuneration and so on. And these munera took place not in big, grand stone amphitheatres, but took place in wooden shack-like things that were put up in the forum, very temporary buildings that would be put up in the main meeting area of the Roman town. And they would draw a crowd of people who would come, and it's not known whether they paid or not at this particular stage. By the time we get to the Colosseum, you've got tickets and ticket touts and the full buna. But at this stage, it was very much a temporary event. So once the staged event was over, the wooden amphitheatre was dismantled and taken away and used as firewood or until it was next required. So these were not permanent structures. The next question is, were they evenly spread across the empire? Well, the answer to that is no. If you look at a map of the Roman Empire, and I'm very grateful to Sebastian Heath for plotting this out, you can see our own little Newstead way up there at the very top, the little purple blob beyond the frontier of the empire. Obviously, Sebastian didn't know that the Antonine Wall was in existence, which would have taken the empire just slightly further. But here we've got the distribution of amphitheatres in the middle of the 3rd century. And you can see that they're unequally spaced and that the biggest concentrations of them are in mainland Italy and also in the area of Tunisia and Libya, which would be an African, would be the Roman colony within Africa. And effectively, where you get amphitheatres is where Roman culture, that is Latin culture, culture that has spread out from Rome, is at its strongest. So that if you've got multiple cultural influences that are very, very Roman rather than Greek or Persian or the country that would be Turkey or other areas like Spain and so on, you would have quite a concentration of amphitheatres. Now, what is surprising to me is how few amphitheatres there are in very highly developed countries during the Roman period, particularly Asia, particularly what is now modern-day Turkey, and also Greece. I mean, there's only a single amphitheatre in Corinth, for example, despite these being very populous areas during the Roman time period, during the empire. So I think there's something here that tells you about the cultural influences that are going on, where you've got a predominantly Greek culture, as you would in Greece or in the the western part of Turkey. Amphitheatres were not a big thing. Theatre was a big thing, but not amphitheatres. So that's a cultural difference. The other interesting thing is that there are almost as many amphitheatres in Britain as there are in Spain. Spain is twice the size of Britain in terms of surface area, but has almost exactly the same number of amphitheatres. So what's going on here? I think part of it is, and it's been alluded to by other scholars, that amphitheatres pop up wherever you've got strong military presence and a strong dominant Romanist presence where Roman military ideals have been taken out into the provinces. And so you've got amphitheatres in Britain that are associated with military sites, mainly military sites, but some civilian sites. And in Spain, there are very few military sites, but mainly predominantly civilian sites. The situation in what is now modern day France, it would have been Gaul, is slightly different. Pretty high concentration of amphitheatres across Gaul suggests a very strong Roman influence. And then along the German frontier, these are amphitheatres that are occurring in relation to military sites, military encampments down the Rhine and Danube frontiers. So interesting distribution of amphitheatres, obviously not even across the empire. Now, we can't talk about amphitheatres without first talking about this, the daddy of them all. I had to get up at 4 o'clock in the morning to take this drone shot. I didn't dare fly over the building itself. Absolutely stupendous structure, Colosseum. The modern day visitor numbers are 4 million visitors a year. So you can see the impact that this has in the public imagination, public perception. And it's been greeted, certainly in modern times, with a mixture of admiration and repulsion in almost equal measure. mean, it's been estimated that 400,000 people died here in this building alone over the course of its over its lifetime. So you can see that that would turn some people on, would turn a lot of people off. In fact, Charles Dickens wrote, "God be thanked, it is now a ruin." In 1846, when he visited it, he did the grand tour, and he was, as I say, admiratious and repelled in equal measure. Mark Twain called it the monarch of all European ruins, and you can see why. I mean, it is truly spectacular, and I would imagine most of you will have been. But I'm going to show you this video clip that I took when I was there in the summertime. Look at the scale. Look at the size of the people on that upper tier as I pan round. It is absolutely massive. It's humongous. It's 190 meters on its long axis. It is a phenomenal piece of engineering, irrespective of what it was being used for. It is a phenomenal piece of engineering, built predominantly with brick and some travertine as well. First question, I suppose, the Colosseum is, why was it called the Colosseum? Was it called the Colosseum because it was big? Well, it actually wasn't called the Colosseum originally. It was known as the Flavian Amphitheatre. I'll explain why in a minute. It didn't get the name Colosseum until quite a lot later on. And the reason it got the name Colosseum was not because of its size, but because of this, the Colossus of Nero that stood beside. This was a huge statue, a bronze statue that Nero had erected to himself. Like many despots in the world, they see themselves as being larger than life size. So he had this constructed. You can imagine one of these being constructed at this very moment in another part of the world. And this was known in those days as the Colossus. And because the Colosseum had been built in the grounds of Nero's previous Domus Aureus, Nero had abused his position as emperor to snap up the centre of Rome after the Great Fire of Rome and build himself a great pleasure garden. And when his material was all swept away, when he became reviled and all of his material was swept away, the Colossus was allowed to stand, but his garden was replaced and the Colosseum was built smack bang in the middle of it, right in the middle of Rome. The statistics are incredible. It's 100,000 cubic meters, 3.5 million cubic feet of travertine, 300 tons of clamps to hold the stonework together. It's got 80 entrances in the circuit. It's 158 feet high. I mean, it is colossal. It is and still is the largest amphitheatre that we know about in the Roman Empire. And you can understand it became the model then for other Colosseum-like buildings. Who built it? Well, as I said, it was called the Flavian Amphitheatre because it was Vespasian, the first of the Flavian emperors, who built it. And he built it immediately after his conquest of Judea. And if you look at this particular sestertius, it's got Judea Capta. You can see the personified Judea bent over as a woman here with her head in her hands below a palm tree. And this was after his successful campaign with Titus against the Jews when they had sacked Jerusalem, and they had taken many hundreds of thousands of prisoners. And it's the sale, we think, the sale of these prisoners as slaves that paid for a significant portion of the Colosseum. It didn't take them very long to build it. It started in about 71 or 72 AD, and Vespasian just died just before it was opened in AD 80 by his successor, his son Titus. And the inaugural games lasted 100 days. That is 100 non-stop days of games. As I've mentioned, it had 80 entrances, very complex underbuilding, which if you go there today, you will see where the animal pits were and the machinery was that brought the animals and the gladiators up into the amphitheatre. It also had this famous movable awning to block out the sun on very hot days. And it's reputed that that awning was manipulated and delivered by members of the Roman Navy who were used to working in masts on the ships at sea. It has essentially a hollow construction. It's effectively built with groin and barrel vaults, successive circuits of groin and barrel vaults, and then faced with travertine seating. There's only very small portions of that left because the Colosseum was effectively used as a quarry. After it fell out of use, it was used as a quarry, and a lot of St. Peter's Cathedral was built from stone from the Colosseum. But even so, there's still quite a lot of the Colosseum remaining, and it's an awesome sight to this day. Now, Charles Dickens and Mark Twain both commented that if you're going to go and see the Colosseum, go and see it at night. And this was a video that I shot in the summertime. It was a warm, balmy night, the seagulls flying around through the ruins, very atmospherically lit, lots of people milling around in the street below. But what a stunning structure, you know, irrespective of what it was ever used for. It is something that almost personifies Rome. But it in itself caused a bit of furore with the Olympics. Colosseum was originally portrayed on the Olympic medal, the gold medal. And you can see here on the left the medal from the 1972 Munich Olympics. And we've gone through to the Australian Olympics. Somebody recognised that this wasn't probably the right thing to be putting on a medal for field sports, when in fact it was entirely blood sports that took part and took place there. So they had to change the design, and the design has been changed into now a Greek stadium. And if you have a look, you can see the Parthenon on the Acropolis on the far left. This is the Beijing medal from 2008. It changed in the intervening period. You've still got Victory with her sheath, her sheath of victory over one arm, and her victory type angel wings. You've still got her, but the Colosseum has disappeared from the medal. And immediately there were copycat buildings, Me Too Colosseums, all across the empire. And some of these buildings are almost as big, not quite, but almost as big. I think Capua is the second biggest, and there's virtually nothing of it left. But you can see where the outer ring of masonry would have been on this huge structure. And this one, astonishing, in Tunisia. If you go to Tunisia, please make the effort to go to El Jem. You've got this low-level, almost mud brick town, 1 or 2 stories high, and in the middle, you've got this vast amphitheatre, and it's made of this honey-coloured sandstone. It is an incredible sight, and a lot of the underbuilding is accessible at El Jem, so it's worth a visit. We went there. The Trimontium Trust went to Libya many years ago. It was about 2 years before Colonel Gaddafi was ousted. We were there. We were the only tourists. There was nobody else there, just us. That's us in the top right. And we visited the museum in Tripoli, which I don't think many people will be visiting it today, and it's a great shame. It's got a phenomenal collection of mosaics, and this is the famous Leighton mosaic, which is quite close to Leptis Magna. It was found in a villa. And this is a wonderful mosaic showing gladiators at work. In the top left panel, you can see the water organ, literally a water-powered pump organ, and trumpeters giving a sort of musical accompaniment to the death and mayhem of gladiators. Then you see the different gladiator types, and I'll mention a bit more about those in a second. Immediately below, off to the right, you've got Damnatio ad Bestias. That is the ritual execution of criminals, convicted criminals, by exposing them to wild animals. You can see this poor individual's being pushed out on a little trolley with two wheels, and he's bound to a post. And they're encouraging it must be a leopard, the spotty thing, to eat him. And then below you've got the Venationes, the animal hunt, where you've got people hunting animals. The chap who's naked with the long thing in his arm, that's a sling. He's just fired a slingshot at a poor donkey or an ass with blood pouring from its head. In the background, you can see a bear shackled to a bull so that they fight to the death. They can't get away from each other. And then this poor guy is being exposed to a lion. He's been pushed forward by the handler, by the hair, and he's been pushed into the mouth of a lion. And this was a type of condemnation. It was a type of execution that was kept for the absolute lowest. It wasn't very nice to be eaten alive in front of 20,000 people. So in terms of size, there are other big amphitheatres. The one at Puteoli is huge. It was built by public subscription. So it didn't have an imperial input, and it was massive as well. It's almost the same size as the Colosseum. The underbuilding there, we were allowed to visit when Trimontium Holiday went to the Bay of Naples, and the underbuilding is incredible. We could get down into the mechanics of the amphitheatre. I don't think you can get access to it anymore, so that's a bit of a shame. But Puteoli is also a cracker. And this is the most complete outer ring of an amphitheatre anywhere in the empire. This is Pula in Croatia. And by some quirk of fate, the original outer encasement of this amphitheatre has been preserved. Nothing much remains in the interior. You can see that there are some banks and modern seats, but the exterior is exceptionally well preserved. So that's nice. And this very much reminds me of the folly above Oban, because this looks down onto the harbour at Pula. And there's, I think it's McCaig's folly at Oban, which is a sort of mini amphitheatre built up on the hill. So who is it that's fighting there? And if anybody knows about this, this is a frieze that's actually inside the Colosseum. I took this picture just recently, and I have a strong suspicion that this is a fake, or at least it's a copy. There's no, like a lot of things in Rome, there's no annotation, there's no public information. This thing just sits there above one of the tiers of seats in the Colosseum, and it looks like a plaster cast of a proper carving somewhere of the different gladiator types. And what was interesting is that when you try to burrow down into the exact name of these different gladiatorial styles, it's quite difficult to find out the exact correlation. Now, one guy who was really interested in the styles, the equipment, the fashions of the gladiators was Jean-Léon Gérôme, who was a very famous French artist of the 19th century, died in 1904. And he really got to grips with depicting gladiators. And this is a sculpture of him sculpting a gladiatorial combat scene. On the right-hand side, this is at Musée d'Orsay. And on the left is a daguerreotype, an early photograph of Jerome himself. And he really went to town on Rome. He romanticized and I think horrified some of the public as well with some of his interpretations of ancient Rome. The one on the right is a slave market where you've got Roman men bidding for this beautiful woman who's just been derobed by some horrible slave trader. And on the left, you've got this worn out slave who's shackled by the neck to an old furnace here with Cave Canem sort of suggestively written on the wall, beware of the dog. And this guy is being kept as a subhuman in shackles. And these are two of Jerome's famous paintings. But he really went to town with this one. This is called Pollice Verso, thumb down. And you can see that the gladiator here as the foot on the neck of a fallen combatant. There's a dead one lying under him. Looks as though it's a retiarius, the net man, because the net's lying to his left hand, and his trident is there, and he's looking up for a sign of whether he should dispatch this fallen combatant or not. And he's asking them for thumbs up or thumbs down. And nobody actually knows whether the sign for death was thumbs up or thumbs down. We know that if the gladiator held up a finger, he was asking for mercy. So if he held up a single finger, some people say it was the small finger, but a lot of the frescoes show the index finger. We know that that was a sign of supplication for mercy, but we don't know whether it was thumbs up or thumbs down. But it's interesting, Jerome has decided to show that the most vicious group in giving the thumbs down are the Vestal Virgins. That's these 6 women in white at the front, because they were the only women who were allowed, apart from the royal entourage, they were the only women who were allowed in the front seats. Not entirely sure why, but the Vestal Virgins had a ring-size seat. So Jerome portrays them as giving the big thumbs down to this poor soul that's flat out. And this is another of his famous paintings. This is Morituri Salutamus. We who are about to die salute you. You can see this group of gladiators all bunched up, holding their tridents and spears and so on up to the emperor. It's a big fat emperor, so I think that's probably supposed to be, I'm not quite sure who that would be. The Colosseum wasn't built till after Nero's death. So anyway, Jerome really got under the skin of sort of gladiatorial combat. He also turned his attention to the whole question of were there any Christian martyrs martyred in the Colosseum. And this is another of his paintings here. The lion has just popped up out of one of the trapdoors and followed, interestingly, by a tiger as well. I don't think you'd get a tiger and a lion kind of sniffing about together. Anyway, there's a tiger and a lion just about to pop up as well. You've got this group of martyrs praying with their elder standing, looking to heaven for guidance. And in the background, you can see this horrific display of burning human torches. And we know the Romans did this, and certainly Nero is reputed to have done this, and I think probably also Caligula, where they coated their victims in tar and set them alight and let them burn as torches, as living torches, to illuminate some of the games. So not a very happy situation. But probing further into this, there's no real evidence that any Christians died in the Colosseum at all. There are Christian martyrs from across the empire, the early empire, and I think there are 1 or 2 died in amphitheatres in the provinces. But I don't think there's hard evidence that Christian martyrs were sacrificed in the Colosseum. Nero's big purge, of course, of Christians takes place before the Colosseum is built. And Victorian painters laboured this point of the Christians being blamed for all of Rome's ills at the time and then being cast to the lions. But as I say, it's not necessarily based on any sort of solid foundation. It doesn't stop the erection of a cross in the Colosseum, and it's been dedicated by a number of popes in the past to Christian martyrs. So I suppose in the absence of evidence to the contrary, I think we could probably assume that some Christians definitely would have come a cropper there at some point. I mentioned the different types of gladiator. When I was in Rome in the summer, there was a huge reenactment group in the Circus Maximus. They were allowed to put up their tents. You can imagine historic Scotland having a fit. They were allowed to put up their tents in the Circus Maximus, build their fake amphitheatre, and then slug it out over the course of a 3-day weekend. It was fabulous to see. And this is an array of some of the helmets. beautiful reenactment replicas here. Now, I've tried to find out what the different gladiators are called, and Mary Beard is quite clear about this. It's not clear who gets what name. We know that there are different types. We know that there's the Thracian and the Hoplomachus and the Murmio and the Secutor and the Retiarius and so on. But we're not entirely sure what name goes with what particular style of armour. But even so, the armour itself is quite spectacular. And one of the things that was common to most of the gladiators was naked flesh. They showed a certain part of their body, either their torso or their thighs or their shoulders would be exposed. So, and obviously, certain gladiators would be pitted against other gladiators so that it tended to be evenly matched. The other interesting thing that I've noticed by looking at frescoes and sculptures is that the swords are not long. As they're portrayed in this artist's impression. You see the Murmillo there has got quite a long gladius. As far as I can tell, it was relatively short swords they fought with so that they could get in close together. So that I think is interesting as well. Now, these are some of the I'll turn the sound off during these three clips. And these are guys who have been trained in reenactment, and there was a whole group of them in Rome at the time, and it was very interesting to watch them training. And the vexed question of did female gladiators ever fight in the amphitheatre? I've researched this over the last week or so, and female gladiators definitely did fight, and a number of ancient Roman authors confirm that is the case. Usually, they would be slaves or condemned women for one reason or another, but some authors suggest that higher ranking women did actually fight in the amphitheatre. But just to please the people of Rome this summer, they had some female gladiators as well, and I have to say they really got torn in. Now, thankfully, their swords were blunted, but I did see one or two injuries while they were practicing. So very interesting, and very impressive to see that sort of thing in the centre of Rome. The amphitheatres had a purpose, though, way beyond the fighting. They represented local power structure, and this is the inscription. There's one at either end of the entrance to the amphitheatre at Pompeii, which, by the way, is the oldest amphitheatre that we know of. And the empire probably built, that stone amphitheatre, probably built about 70 BC. And it's been dedicated by two very wealthy local big men, principal figures in the town of Pompeii. And so they represented local power structures, and there was a sort of obligation on the elite of that particular town to pull together the resources, not necessarily their own resources, but pull together the resources for these centres of public spectacle. And the responsibility for putting the shows on would very often lie with these decuriones, these top two, or duo vires. You can see the second line, it's called duo vires, of the two top men, like almost like the consuls of the town. And they were almost obligated to entertain the local people. It was all part of the yin and yang of power structure in that time period. And gladiatorial combat, the arena spectacle permeated almost every aspect of Roman life. It wasn't a sort of peripheral thing. It wasn't hidden. It was absolutely front and center in the heavily Romanized parts of the empire that had a lot of Latin culture. And there are frescoes and mosaics right across the empire showing. There's even two mosaics from Britain that show gladiatorial combat. And this is a mosaic showing animals being taken from Africa on board a boat to be transported to the Colosseum, and hundreds of thousands of animals met their end in the amphitheatres of Italy every year. The toll on animal life, and particularly animals coming from Africa, must have been phenomenal, because it's not easy to get 10 elephants on a boat and then take them off to have them fight in the Colosseum. And as I say, it permeates all of Roman life. There's a pocket knife from Piddington Roman Villa in Northamptonshire. Beautiful. That's the original on the left and a replica on the right. We've got friends at Piddington that keep in touch, and this is one of the beautiful things that they've had made a replica of. As a folding pocket knife, again in the shape of a heavily armoured gladiator with his heavy helmet. These helmets, by the way, weigh about 12 or 13 pounds in weight. But at the moment, we're very lucky. We have a beautiful exhibition from Holger of his lamps. These are clay lamps, and these all have gladiatorial motifs. So if you're in Melrose, come into the museum, you'll see the display. This is just some of them. They're absolutely stunning. And you've got gladiators of different types and different poses, some of them fighting literally hand to fist, others posing with their weapons and so on. And then I quite like the second left at the bottom, where the bear has actually caught the huntsman, and the bear is eating the huntsman. He's had to drop his whip as the bear's chomping away into his left shoulder. But lots of other small bits of decorative bronze. These are all brooches or little appliques from furniture with gladiators in various poses. And here on the right, you've got this larger roundel of a gladiator, of a Venatores fighting with what looks like a leopard or a female lion. And again, knife handles made of ivory or made of bone. And this is a folding pocket knife. The metal blade, the iron blade is quite corroded, but the ivory is beautiful. And I think probably for me the best is this one. This is another knife handle with this secutor with his amazing helmet, and again this short blade, this short curved blade in his right hand. So that little exhibition's running at the moment if you want to pop in. I'm just going to spend the last 5 or 10 minutes talking about the Roman view, because as I mentioned earlier, we might be repelled by all of this, but the Romans certainly weren't. But there were some critics, and I've listed the critics here. But if you listen to the criticisms, it's not exactly what you would think. Seneca, for example, is probably the most outspoken. He was the tutor of Nero and ends up being executed or told to commit suicide by Nero. He says, nothing is as ruinous to the character as sitting away one's time at a show, for it is then through the medium of entertainment that vices creep in with more than the usual ease. So effectively, he's warning against vice, not necessarily about the amphitheatre itself. He does advise a friend of his, a sensitive friend called Lucilius, to stay away because you go home more selfish, more self-seeking, and more self-indulgent, as well as crueler and less humane. So, I mean, he has some measure of what's going on, but it's not outright condemnation. The thing that did turn him off was the noontime execution of criminals, because he thought that there was no artistry. And I wonder if there had been more artistry, fireworks and so on, he would have been less critical. He felt it was tasteless and had no moral lesson for the onlookers. So Seneca is often quoted as the Roman that found the games most objectionable. Tacitus um, contrasts it with Greek traditions, and this probably goes back to why you don't find amphitheatres in Greece or Turkey. He said that the Greeks used tragedies to explore deep human emotion and contradictions without physically harming the actors, whereas the Roman games seem to delight in the cold negativity of naked murder. So it's quite a direct observation of this comparison between Greek culture and Latin culture. You saw the Romans' people enthusiasm as well as evidence of their decline. You was always seen decline in the Roman Empire, even before it got really underway. The decline from a free, virtuous citizenry to a servile population obsessed with trivial, bloody entertainment. So, fairly strong words. Cicero said it's not suitable for a man of refinement, and there's no pleasure to be had seeing a weak man torn apart by an extremely powerful animal or a splendid animal transfixed by a spear. I think he's definitely got something there. But again, this is a sort of passing comment from Cicero. Tertullian, on the other hand, is one of the early Christian fathers. He displays his Christian ideals in a complete revulsion from the amphitheatre, and he believed that the excitement and pleasure that people got from seeing the suffering of others was completely incompatible with Christian beliefs and tenets. And he wrote that the innocent can find no pleasure in another person's sufferings. He also warned that the spectacles encouraged violence, bloodlust, and cruelty, general immorality, all of which irreparably harmed the viewer's character. And I suppose it comes back to what psychologists have been warning us about watching, brutal films and so on, that it can have a desensitizing effect on people's personality. But good old Pliny, he comes back in again. There's nothing really here for weak people. It's really it's there so that you don't soften your character or break the manly spirit, but something that awakens contempt for death and indifference to wounds. So he was saying that it's a form of desensitization that's important for the strong Roman soldier, the strong Roman character. We know that some emperors did actually participate. Caligula and Nero were supposed to have participated on and off, but Commodus definitely did. He took part in numerous, as Cassius Dio tells us this, that Commodus took part in numerous events, particularly set piece events where the opponent was given a wooden sword and he was given a metal one to fight the opponent. And of course, this is played out in Gladiator 1 by the Joaquin Phoenix fighting with Russell Crowe, and Phoenix, of course, cheats, but is killed by Russell Crowe. But in fact, in real life, that doesn't happen. But Commodus almost certainly did take part in some of the gladiatorial events, particularly the wild beast hunting. They were eventually banned by the emperors. Constantine, as the empire became Christian, Constantine banned them fairly ineffectually in 325. They carried on. Theodosius gave out another edict in 393, but it wasn't until Honorius banned gladiatorial combat in 404 that they stopped. But even then, the animal hunts and the chariot races carried on. The chariot races could be pretty brutal as well. But the animal hunts did continue at least up till the 6th century. The amphitheatres had an afterlife. If they weren't used for a quarry, they would often be fortified or turned into some sort of structure. This is the amphitheatre in Arles, which had houses built within it. This is one of the reasons why some of the amphitheatres have survived through to this day. And pseudo-gladiatorial combat still takes place to this day, and there's a direct lineage of this from the animal hunting events in the Roman times right through to modern day Madrid. This is the bull ring in Madrid, and a matador fighting in the arena there. And you can see how like the Roman amphitheatre this actually looks. while I'm on the subject of the bull ring in Madrid, for those of us interested in Scottish medicine, this is the only place that you'll see a statue to Alexander Fleming being bowed to by a matador. Fleming is a bronze bust, and the matador is a full-sized figure that stands there with his cape over his arm. He's doffed his hat, and he's bowing to Fleming for the discovery of penicillin, which completely transformed the life expectancy of matadors who had been gored, because being gored was a terminal event because of infection, and Fleming turned all of that around. So if you're in Madrid, go along to the bull ring and see this amazing vignette of statues. And it does go on in different forms today. American football effectively is heavily armed men knocking lumps out of each other in a form of sort of bloodless combat. Same with rugby. These are direct descendants of sort of the physical games that would have get played out. And for those of you who are into science fiction, of course, the future holds rollerball. As you know, the whole idea behind rollerball was something that's built like the Colosseum, where people had to compete to the death to find this big silver ball. It's a film of my teenage years that some of you will remember, but in essence, it's the science fiction future of the Colosseum. So, in conclusion, highly ritualized events taking place in these amphitheatres, in essence, is closely regulated violence linked to the civic, religious, and legal life of Rome. It was intimately tied to the power structure of Rome. It was a display of Roman power and order. It was a reinforcement of the hierarchy, because there was a social hierarchy in where you could sit, for example, in the Colosseum. There was also the public demonstration and implementation of justice, and it allowed the emotional bonding of the crowd. I came back to this, the desensitization question. Was this deliberately, as had been suggested by one of the Roman authors, an attempt to desensitize the population? Did repeated exposure reduce empathy? Did it normalize violence? I think probably to an extent it did. But I think the Colosseum and the amphitheatres were not built for that specific purpose. I think they just simply reflected existing Roman values. And finally, I want to finish with this absolutely stunning fresco. I didn't know this existed until I started doing this bit of research. This is found in the house of Actius Anicetus in Pompeii itself. And it's a fresco that shows the riot that took place between the Pompeian spectators and the Newsteadian spectators. Newstead is a town not that far away. And there'd obviously been some conflict that had started off as catcalling. Then they'd started throwing stones and bottles at each other, and then it turned into a bloodbath. And you can see the bloodbath taking place in the fresco at the top right of the fresco. And it was so bad, and so many Newsteadians were killed in the riot, that it was referred to Nero back in Rome, and the Senate sat and made a decision that there would be no gladiatorial combats in Pompeii for a decade. So between 59 and 69 AD, the amphitheatre wasn't used, or it certainly wasn't used for gladiatorial combat. The other interesting thing from the fresco is it's almost like a drone photograph of the site, because on the left, you've got the stairway up, which is still there today. There's 4 stairways exactly like that up to the amphitheatre itself. And on the right, you've got the palaestra, the exercise yard, where some members of the public or gladiators or whoever would be training could exercise in. And if you have a look, it even shows the swimming pool that is still there to this day. So this is as good as you can get as sort of photorealism of a snapshot of the time period. And this fresco must have been done sometime between 59 and 79 when the city was flattened. So I find this absolutely fascinating. And finally, as you know, Trimontium is well recognised now for its use of visual technology. And this is the Colchester vase. which was found in the Roman town of Colchester. You can see two gladiators fighting here. One of them has been unarmed and he's got his index finger up asking for mercy. And the other guy with the sword and helmet is still going at it. And so I took this the other night there and put it through our AI engine. And this is what we produced. So it's interesting what you can do with modern technology. So thank you very much, and I'd be happy to take any questions.
Thank you, John. Fascinating talk this evening, and lots of great comments coming in tonight. Just a quick recap of our 125 plus attendees online tonight. I mentioned some of the earlier ones, but we had Paul up in the Wirral, Joanne snowed in for the last 8 days on Orkney, Becca in Lancashire, James over in New Zealand says a to us from New Zealand, Bill in Perth, Scotland, not Perth, Australia, Peter in St Albans, and our friends Avril and Ian over in Edinburgh. So many people have sent their wishes and thanks for tonight's talk, John. Thought it might be
Thank
worth
you.
mentioning at this point that, of course, in the gallery in Melrose, which reopens on the 13th of February, we're closed for a little bit of time to reconvene and rejig a few things. But we reopen on the 13th of February, Friday the 13th. There is a small exhibition of loaned objects depicting gladiators. We talked about the Thrax, Mamillo, Retaria, Secutor, and they can all be seen on these beautiful oil lamps that we have on display in the gallery itself. And you showed one of the knives, which is on display as well, with various images and depictions of different gladiators. That's well worth a visit if you're in the borders on the 13th of February when we open for 2026. Thought it might be worth mentioning as well a little bit of active historical fact finding. You showed the Olympic medals with the Colosseum being changed back to the Greek Stadium Athens. I can attest to running around that track in the hot Athens sun and setting off at 200-meter pace is a mistake when you realise the track is actually around about 440 meters long. And you're racing against a rather fit 14-year-old. I failed on the first bend and collapsed and had to be resuscitated. So, all in the name of exploration and historical kind of
Reenactment.
reenactment, exactly. So we've got a lot of good points coming today. Andrew's mentioned, just for interest, this is Andrew Newton, a friend of ours here at Trimontium, about a small rural amphitheatre in the Mendip Hills near the lead
Yes.
mines,
Yep.
which was the source of some of the lead for the lead work in Pompeii, he mentions.
That's right.
Interestingly, there's no military camp, only a small fortlet for the guards in the mining area. So that's a little message that's coming from Andrew, which some people have come across in the chat. And then Phil mentions the remains of a female gladiator discovered in Southwark. Assumed she fought for the Romans in the London Amphitheatre, of
Wow.
which I'm sure many people are or may be aware that those are available for access under the Guildhall in the City of London, which is well worth a visit. We've got a couple of questions come in, and we had someone without a microphone. So this is Ian without a microphone, so I'll pose a question. So can Ian ask, are there any traces of gladiatorial equipment or gladiator remains from Trimontium? And do you think there's any chance of archaeology turning anything up in the future in that respect?
Sadly, there aren't. The excavation at the amphitheatre has been pretty minimal so far in terms of surface area, so we don't know. But usually, you don't find equipment, even in the big amphitheatres. You don't find residual equipment. The situation was different at Pompeii because there was a cache of gladiatorial armor and so on found. I think it was probably in the Plystra or quite nearby the Plystra outside the amphitheatre. So I think probably our chances of coming across actual gladiatorial equipment is probably pretty slim. Although some gladiator helmets, for example, have been found across the empire. So never say never is the answer.
Brilliant. Thank you, John. And thank you for that question. We've got Jay Lockett in Houston, Texas. Came in a bit late today, but says welcome and thanks. Lots of fantastic comments for tonight's talk from lots of our friends and followers. Got a question. I'm just going to try and call up the person to try and ask it themselves. If I just whiz myself through, possibly Tina and Andy. Do you want to turn your microphone on, Tina and Andy, and ask a question to John directly?
Yes, good evening.
Good evening.
Given that the Trimontium fort, for most of its occupied time, was outside the Empire effectively, would it not have been a problem actually getting gladiators up there to go and fight?
That's a very good question. And I suspect that probably not many professional gladiators ever fought at Trimontium. I suspect that a lot of it was animal hunts, things like bear baiting, and probably executions. In fact, almost certainly executions, ritual punishments, and so on. So, but there's always been the suggestion that you had this scenario that was portrayed in the first Gladiator film of a traveling impresario with a group of gladiators. And we definitely know that such characters did exist. And who knows, if you've got traveling salesmen coming to Trimontium to sell their wares, their pottery and jewelry and so on, who says that they wouldn't bring an entertainment group? For a significant portion of the time, Trimontium was the service fort or a service fort for the Antonine Wall. So it was actually within the empire for probably about 40 years, so maybe 2 generations. That's quite a long time. If you think about troop entertainments in the Second World War, that was a 5-year war, and there was a lot of big troop entertainments went on in that 5-year period. We've got 40 years of troops and their civilian supports here. So it wouldn't be too far-fetched to see somebody like the Oliver Reid character bowling into town with 2 or 3 flea-bitten gladiators to pitch up against some of the other contestants. I thought I'd just give you an interesting figure from Pompeii. There is a record from Pompeii of in detail of the outcome of bouts. And this particular record is of 23 bouts with 46 fighters. 21 fighters won outright. 17 were let off without death sentence, and 8 were killed by the sort of thumbs down. So that gives a death rate of 1 in 6 gladiators per show, which is quite high. It's much higher than I'd thought. And Mary Beard, in her assessment of gravestones, points out that the average age at death of those gladiators that ended up getting a gravestone, and that presumably is only a proportion of them, but of those gladiators who ended up getting a gravestone, the average age at death was 22, whereas the average age of death of a male who'd lived through infancy was 48. So your chances of being killed was quite high. It was about 13% per fight. So, but even so, traveling impresarios may well have brought the odd gladiator troop to Trimontium, especially if you've got soldiers there prepared to pay the entrance fee.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you for your question, Andy. That's great. And I think comment in the chat from Jay Lockett again says that I suspect amphitheatres are rather like modern concert venues. Trimontium might not have gotten the famous top players, but I'm sure there were local acts that will quite happily enjoy the captive audience.
Absolutely.
I think absolutely right there. I think agree. We do have a question in from Alan Montgomery. Alan, do you want to turn your mic on and ask your question?
Hi there.
Hi, good evening,
Hi.
Alan.
Thank you for a great talk. My question was, you've already mentioned that there's only been very limited excavation at the Trimontium Amphitheatre, and I wondered if there might be plans for something a bit more substantial.
The answer to that is yes. We've always got plans for more substantial work at the site. The amphitheatre itself has been literally had the surface scratched, and I think that we could certainly do a lot more geophysics there and some targeted excavation. The excavation techniques have moved on a lot in the last 30 years. and certainly the micro excavation might tell us something about the surface of the amphitheatre. I think it's probably at Chester Amphitheatre that they found a big dump of sand outside where the amphitheatre is at Chester. And that sand is very different from all the other sand in the area. And it had clearly been brought in to line the floor of the amphitheatre. And they found human teeth in the sand. So it's likely that there will be micro finds in and around the amphitheatre, Alan. So don't expect we'll find anything big, but I think there might be some interesting material from the fine morphology of the floor of the amphitheatre.
Brilliant. Thank you. Thank you for the question, Alan. Thank you, John. We've got a hand up. I think there's a hand raised from Kenneth. Kenneth, do you want to? That may be Kenny. I'm not sure.
Yep, that's me.
Yeah. All right, Kenny. Do you want to fire away?
Yep. Good evening, John.
Good evening, Kenny.
Carol, being such a savvy person, did he never suspect that there was something going on in that dip at Trimontium? And also, another question is, Newstead is supposed to be the most northerly Roman amphitheatre. Could there be something maybe further north, even at Elgin Hall or something that's never been discovered?
Two good questions, Kenny. Carol, as far as I know, never considered an amphitheatre at Newstead. Certainly not in his book, and I haven't come across anything that suggested that he was looking for an amphitheatre or felt that that might be an amphitheatre. So Ian Richmond certainly paid it attention, but didn't. He veered away from calling it an amphitheatre and thought it was a gravel pit. So Bill Loney was the first, I think, as far as I know, to call it that. To answer your other question, I think, in fact, I'm sure that there will be an amphitheatre somewhere at Inveresk. Inveresk is one of these sites that just spreads further and further out into the surrounding countryside. And it almost certainly was the nerve centre of the Antonine Wall, or at least the Antonine occupation. We've got imperial procurator inscriptions from there. And the imperial procurator is the second in charge of the whole of the empire, of the whole of the province. So I think you've got enough people, you've got enough critical mass of people, soldiers, civilian settlement to have a substantial amphitheatre there. The wooden thing that was found was initially thought to be an amphitheatre. I think people have backed off from that. But then, they only found the Mithraeum there, which has got two of these amazing altars. They only found that by accident underneath the cricket pitch. So goodness knows what else there is to find in and around Inveresk. So yes, I think further north there will be something.
Okay, thank you, John.
Thank you.
Thank you, Kenny. And I think that's a great point to end on. Kenny squeezing two questions in for the price of one. There's a lot of good messages coming in from our friends and members online tonight. I'd just like to thank John for his talk tonight, and thank everyone for attending tonight. There's been a wave of positivity for tonight's talk. I think John's just popped the slide up. Do you want to mention this, John, quickly?
Yeah, this is Gordon Noble's talk, which is the next one on Thursday, the 12th of February. Gordon, of course, wrote Picts, the Scourge of Rome, Rulers of the North, and it's about the Pictish development of East Lomond Hill, which is the right-hand one. If you look across the River Forth to Fife, you see these two things called the Paps of Fife sticking up. The right-hand one is, in fact, a hill fort, and that's the artist's impression of what it looked like. Gordon, who is a tireless excavator, has been excavating there, and he's been finding links with Rome during his excavation. So that'd be a really interesting talk next month.
Brilliant. Thank you, John. We'll let you retire for the evening.
Thank you.
I'd like